Welcome everyone to this evening. Ayodeji Malcolm Guite is a poet and priest in the Church of England. Born in Nigeria, where his father was a Methodist minister, Guite was sent to boarding school in England at a young age. Years later, his return to faith came about through the poetry of John Keats, and he eventually pursued ordination after graduate work on George Herbert, one of the Anglican poets he will speak about tonight. His own poetry is shaped by these traditional forms, but is marked by Guite's use of clear and contemporary language. Like the American poet Christian Wyman, Guite's work is concerned with the spiritual life and how that interior life can be expressed through creative acts of imagination. For many years a chaplain at Girton College, Cambridge, Guite is no stranger to college campuses and to spiritual seekers from all over the world. He is the author of many books of poetry and theology, including Sounding the Seasons, Sonnets for the Liturgical Year, The Singing Bowl, Lifting the Veil, Imagination in the Kingdom of God, and David's Crown, Sounding the Psalms. Guite has also collected multiple anthologies of poetry, has his own YouTube channel, and frequently collaborates with musicians from all over the world. The Schola, by the way, will conclude Malcolm's lecture with another hymn, and I wanted to let you all know that following our lecture here, there will be a special reception in Convocation Hall across the quad, where there will be copies of Malcolm's works available for purchase, and hopefully he'll be able to sign autographs if he's willing and able. But the School of Theology in All Saints Chapel is absolutely delighted to welcome Malcolm Guite to this special lecture tonight.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it was a pleasure to hear that poem of Donne's sung so beautifully for us by the Schola. Donne, it's a poem of confession. Donne is confessing his sins, and he says to God each time, playing on his name, "When thou hast done, thou hast not done, for I have more." And he never tired of making that pun, actually. When he married Anne, his wife, secretly, because her father deeply disapproved, but nevertheless legally, so there's nothing he could do about the marriage, but he did cast Donne into prison. And when Donne was writing to his friends to get the bail, he signed the letter, "John Donne, Anne Donne, undone." So he was a wit indeed. Someone once wrote a book about him simply called The Monarch of Wit. But he could combine the pun with great seriousness and depth of spiritual expression. And of course, at the end of that, all those sins, the sins which I won others to sin, and my sin was their door, and the sin I shunned a year or two, but wallowed in a score. It's wonderful. It's very comforting if you think someone as great as Donne, was like the rest of us wallowing in sin. But at the end, he says in that song, that poem, "I have a sin of fear, that when I've spun my last thread, I'll be stranded on the shore," and so on. And he says, "Swear by thyself, thy sun will shine as clear." So he's even then exercising a memento mori, a sense of that he needs to focus on death and be frank about the fear of it. Well, he stayed in London, ministering his parish. This was before he became Dean of St. Paul's. He stayed in London when the plague had come, ministering to his parishioners, and then became convinced that he had in fact got that disease. And he wrote a poem called "Hymn to God, my God, in my sickness." And it's a very interesting, just as the Schola have done a little musical piece to precede or be a prelude or opening door to this lecture, it's all downhill from here. So Donne, at the beginning of this poem about his sickness, begins with a short verse with a beautifully expressed musical metaphor. It's like a little introit. The rest of the poem doesn't take up the musical analogy at all. The rest of the poem is about that awful experience of being prodded and poked by physicians. He compares his body to a map and says, they're drawing all these lines on me, it's not looking good, you know. But I want to contemplate with you this evening, I've called my lecture The Poetry of Music and the Music of Poetry. And I want to think particularly about Donne and then Herbert, and to see how they explore this theme of music. Music both in itself and music as the best analogy we have for certain kinds of spiritual experience. So on the little handout, which I hope you have or have sight of, I've given you this prelude, this introit poem, introit verse to the longer and larger poem, Hymn to God, My God in My Sickness. It's a really remarkable piece of writing, just these 5 lines. So Donne writes, "Since I am coming to that holy room, where with thy choir of saints forevermore, I shall be made thy music. As I come, I tune the instrument here at the door. What I must do then, think here before." It's an extraordinary metaphor, it's a beautiful metaphor. It's life itself, the whole of it, and including the moment as a kind of tuning up. That wonderful, exciting sound when an orchestra is tuning up and somebody gives them the note and but you're ready. This is just tuning up. If you thought there was good melody and in life now, just imagine what it's going to be like. I might say, when we really start playing or we really start singing in the new creation. But Donne does something much more extraordinary and extravagant than that. A minor poet would have said, "Where with thy choir of saints forevermore, I shall perform thy music, or I shall make thy music." He turns it around, "Where with thy choir of saints forevermore, I shall be made thy music." I am going to become music itself, the only analogy for that communion of saints, that adoration of the Trinity, that receipt and filling and overflowing with the divine bounty of goodness that's part of the beatific vision, is that one has become music. And of course he's drawing on long traditions, indeed going back to pre-Christian sources. The Pythagoras, has a very sense that the whole creation itself is structured on the harmony of music and on the harmonic notes in a scale. They all felt that there was a music of the spheres. You may remember the famous passage where Shakespeare expresses that sense of that music already in heaven and somehow in us, but not heard or expressed. You remember where the sort of romantic scene where the young would-be lover, puts his arm around Jessica and says, "Sit, Jessica, look how the floor of heaven is thick inlaid with patines of bright gold. There's not the smallest orb which thou beholdst, but in his motion, like an angel sings, still choiring to the young-eyed cherubims. Such harmony is in immortal souls. But whilst this muddy vesture of decay doth grossly close it in, we cannot hear it." So there's a music there. And this was felt to be literally, each of the stars and the fixed planets was believed to be set in a whole globe, a kind of invisible crystalline sphere, which turned, the whole sphere invisibly turned, and that's what accounted for the movement of the heavenly body. And it was believed that the movement of these spheres itself created a kind of music. And of course, Dante had beautifully expressed that the prime mover, the primum mobile is God, but Dante makes it even clearer that it is love, and he finishes his poem, "The love that moves the sun and the other stars." So there is a concept already that there is heavenly music, but Donne introduces something really significant, which is the idea of tuning. It's a frank confession, just as frank as his confession of sin in the song we've just heard, that we are out of tune, that there's something untuned in us. And I thought it might be interesting to sometimes, I mean, Donne is a poet, a poet of compression. He puts so much into a single line. Sometimes during his sermons, he'll take an image which we've seen very compressed in a poem and open it out. And there's a very interesting relation, I think, between his preaching and his poetry. So I've given you, I think, also in this, a couple of passages from Donne's sermons, which may open up this beautiful image of tuning and how that relates to our spiritual life, particularly to, we are going to be made music by the Father, but he brings the Son and the Spirit into this question of tuning. So here's the first part. You'll see from this how much Donne just enjoyed language and sometimes just made words up. I think consinity is a kind of Donnism. But it was no wonder that they called him the Chrysostom of his age, the golden mouth. So here's Donne from a sermon. God made this whole world in such an uniformity, such a correspondency, such a consinity of parts, that it was an instrument perfectly in tune. We may say the trebles, the highest strings, were disordered first. The best understandings, angels and men, put this instrument out of tune. So here's a beautiful analogy for the fall, first of the angels and then of us, that it's a falling out of tune, a falling out of harmony. So, put this instrument out of tune, and then comes, brilliant, as far as I can see, this image is original to Donne, though I think it's a wonderful way of thinking about what we mean by saying Christ as perfect man as well as perfect God, fully man and fully God, fully human. Put this instrument out of tune. God rectified all again by putting in a new string. The Messias, and only by sounding that string in your ears, become we musicum carmen, true music, true harmony, true peace to you. Now that is just a brilliant idea. I mean, as anybody who knows a stringed instrument, and of course it's one thing to have really good guitars nowadays with decent tuners, but if you were playing a lute that was literally strung with stretching catgut, and it was a lute of many courses, it's like people with harps now. You spend far more time tuning up than doing anything else. But, of course, if you have an instrument out of tune, you need a true note. If you know one string, certainly the way I tune a guitar before they had this, if I know one string is right, or I'm given a note from the piano, from that one string, I can tune everything else up. I can touch the harmonics, I can turn the key, and as long as I have one true note, I can tune up. So that's a brilliant idea. If we think of this out-of-tuneness as the fall of angels and the fall of humanity and its consequent effects on creation, and we see Christ coming in, the second Adam, if you like, unfallen, fully. Irenaeus says the glory of God is a human being fully alive. There's a sense in which none of us have been fully alive since the fall, but here is an unfallen, fully alive person showing you what humanity should be, what it actually is. And by looking at him, by listening to him, by following his teachings, we are, as it were, gradually retuning our own slackened and disordered strings into some kind of proper, we don't have to be the same note. We have this one note and we're given other notes. And in fact, as we'll see from Herbert shortly, Herbert is really interested in the diversity of music, the diversity of notes, vied and multiplied, as he says later, which allows for harmony. So, Donne in the first extract here is saying, let me preach Christ to you, because only if we come to Christ can we tune up. And that surely informs, since he's addressing God, I tune my instrument here at the door. I'm just about to go on, as it were. I'm in the wings, that last quick tune before I leave this world and become your music. So, and I love the idea in that first extract that the whole cosmos, the entire cosmos, is an instrument, is a single instrument. We're all various parts of it. Pythagoras, and then later one of his more mystical exponents, a Franciscan friar called Francesco Giorgi, wrote a Latin treatise called De Harmonia Mundi, which Donne had probably seen, in which he works that idea of the instrument out very clearly. But he's a kind of Neoplatonist, and you don't get this disharmony or the need for Christ as the string. But Donne is a good Reformed theologian, and he knows that by ourselves we'll never find the right note. But that note is sounded in Christ. But then in another sermon, he goes on to speak of the Spirit. So he's talking about the Spirit working in us in repentance, Jesus saying that, I'm giving you the good news to share, but the Spirit will convict people of their sin. So Donne says, so when a natural man comes to be displeased with his own actions, though his natural faculties be the instruments in these actions, yet the Holy Ghost sets this instrument in tune and makes all that is music and harmony in the faculties of this natural man. So there's a kind of, if you like, the other part of Christ is the string to which we tune up, but the Holy Spirit is coming to help us actually do the tuning and get us back into harmony. So Donne is clearly very much working with that musical analogy, and I find it helpful and beautiful. Now let's think about George Herbert, who is just 20 years Donne's junior, but of course they know each other because Herbert's mother, Magdalene Herbert, was one of the great spirits of her age. She was a brilliant woman. She was a great hostess extraordinary. She in any other age, she would have been the poet or the philosopher or the professor. She was extremely gifted and easily the match of men like Donne, and actually was the mother of a man like Herbert. So, and she and Donne were friends, particularly after Donne was widowed. She saw him as, he was actually having a very difficult time. He had loads of kids to bring up. He was Dean of St. Paul's in this kind of drafty deanery. So she was a woman of great hospitality, and she used to invite him around and he would come around. Now you can imagine how nice that was for George Herbert. Like if you're a wannabe metaphysical poet, it's not bad when your mum asks genial Uncle John to come round and you've got Donne, regularly there. And he would almost certainly have heard Donne preach and seen the example of the way in which Donne's poetry informed his preaching, and his preaching in some sense reflected on his poetry. And George Herbert had an enviable upbringing because he was, he had Donne as a person who came around regularly to his mother's sort of salons and soirees and sort of intellectual supper parties. And then when he went to school at Westminster, he had Lancelot Andrews, who was then the Dean of Westminster and one of the main translators of the Authorized Version and perhaps the greatest preacher of his age. Lancelot Andrews was his personal tutor and taught him his Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. And then of course he crowned it all by coming up to Cambridge, wisely choosing that rather than the other university, and was a fellow of Trinity and the University Orator, set for the glittering prizes, but set it all aside. He and his friend Nicholas Ferrer did this radical thing where they didn't go for the glittering prizes, they didn't go for this. Ferrer was set for a career in the Virginia Company, and Herbert was set for a glittering career, probably in the House of Commons and then in the court of James. And a greater king called both of them, and their friends thought they just kind of absolute social and career suicide to be ordained in the Anglican Church. Who would do that in the Episcopal Church? So, and they went and apparently, buried themselves, one in a tiny country parish at Little Gidding and the other in a tiny country parish at Bemerton. and they kept up a correspondence and encouraged one another in what they were doing. And they both lived out a parable of parish and community, not without struggles, terrible struggles, and a lot of Herbert's best poems are about the struggle. Eventually, when Herbert realized he was dying, he sent the manuscript of the temple, the collection of poems, by a messenger, a horseman, all the way over from Bemerton near Salisbury, right across to Little Gidding in Huntingdonshire, with a note to his friend Nicholas Ferrer saying, "These are the record of the struggles, not the nice, easy, golden piety, but the struggles that have passed between me and my Lord. If you think they might be of help to any other soul, feel free to publish them. If not, just throw them on the fire." And luckily for us, Nicholas Ferrer was quite a good discerner of verse and realized what a treasure house he had here. And eventually he rode not far to nearby Cambridge, and the poems were published in 1633, the year Herbert died, and they've actually never been out of print since. They fell out of fashion in the 18th century, but they were rediscovered in the 19th and 20th. So let's just have a look then at a poem of Herbert's, which I think actually depends, at least obliquely, on that brilliant, and as far as I know it's an image original to Donne, of Christ himself as a string taught on the instrument, tuned perfectly, to which the rest of us tune up. So, as you know, Easter by George Herbert is actually a two-part poem. There's the thing about making the hymn, and then there's the hymn itself. But I've just given you the first part, because that's what concerns us in this question of the poetry of music and the music of poetry. So you will know this poem well, but let's just hear it. I always feel poetry doesn't live on the flat page. It has to be breathed into being. Poetry, I may as well mention the music of poetry side of this now. Poetry of this kind and order, for this poetry, music is the best analogy. Meter is the equivalent of tempo. And all the beautiful modulating sound effects, not just rhyme, but assonance and alliteration and very slant rhymes, all kinds of things like that, are like the equivalent of melody. And the poem, as I say, doesn't live on the flat page. It has to be spoken into being. And I hope you'll hear some of the musical modulation that's going on in this poem. So here we are, the first part of Easter by George Herbert. Rise, heart, thy Lord is risen. Sing his praise without delays, who takes thee by the hand, that thou likewise with him mayst rise, that as his death calcined thee to dust, his life may make thee gold and much more just. Awake, my lute, and struggle for thy part with all thy art. The cross taught allward to resound his name, who bore the same. His stretched sinews taught all strings what key is best to celebrate this most high day. Consort both heart and lute, and twist a song pleasant and long, or, since all music is but three parts, vied and multiplied, O let thy blessed spirit bear a part and make up our defects with his sweet art. So, three stanzas, the consort of the heart and the lute, and then I need this third part, the spirit who is in tune. The Holy Ghost sets this instrument in tune and makes all that is music and harmony. So let's just work out what's going on in this poem. I mean, there's a huge amount happening in this particular poem. So if you want to know what George Herbert is reading, what he's praying, what he's breathing and thinking at any particular time, especially when he gives you an obvious actual day like Easter Day. You need only consult the lectionary of the Book of Common Prayer. And those of you who follow it will know that the earliest service on Easter Day, the psalm that's set is Psalm 57. And in fact, this whole poem is a response to a few verses in Psalm 57, really 8 to 11. But specifically verse 9, you may remember, "Awake up, my glory, awake, lute and harp. I myself will awake right early." Now, occasionally people don't make it over in time for Matins. You know, it's actually quite a challenge getting up. And we know that he said some offices that weren't necessarily, and he would be sort of saying them in bed. So I don't think this is a poem of heroic early rising. I think this is a poem that chronicles the struggle to get up. Like, it's a poem about having hit the snooze button, really, and then realizing something more. Of course, that Psalm 57 is set, and I imagine Herbert sort of murmuring it in bed and going, awake, awake, oh, awake, my lord. I myself will awake, and that right early. Is it that time already? Oh my goodness, I'm going to be late. And in fact, in the poem, he makes it clear to Christ that he's not getting up without help. Rise, heart. Well, if you tell your heart to rise, it's not. Rise, heart, thy Lord is risen. Sing his praise without delays. I don't take too much time, before you scuttle across. I've been in both the little church in Bemerton and happily in that vicarage as well. And it is literally just across the road, the church from each other. But you can imagine sort of Herbert, realizing the time and scuttling across with his hair uncombed, without delays. Sing his praise without delays. Who takes thee by the hand, that thou likewise with him mayst rise. So on one sense, I think you have this particular Easter morning when Herbert has been in danger of sleeping in, and there's kind of, as it were, Jesus is there to help him. But of course, underneath that is the resurrection of the body, the general resurrection. Rise, heart, thy Lord is risen. Christ the first fruits, and then all who are in Christ. The head is up, the rest of the body is to follow. For all of us, our resurrection is in some sense Jesus reaching and holding us. I was very pleased to see in the other chapel of the Apostles that you had the icon of Jesus rising from the tomb on Easter Day and holding out his hand to Adam and Eve and pulling them up, as it were, from Hades in order to be alive with him. So, of course, he's making this one perhaps slightly oversleepy Easter morning, when the psalm reminds him he was supposed to have been up some time ago, as the kind of portal or gateway into a celebration of Easter itself and of that greater thing. And also love, so rise heart, thy Lord is risen, sing his praise without delays, who takes thee by the hand that thou likewise with him mayst rise. Now, who takes thee by the hand? We know where that's going to go when he writes the final poem in the temple, which is, of course, love bade me welcome, but my soul. And do you remember? Love took my hand and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I. So it's beautiful, tactile thing. And of course, the sense of taking a hand and helping you to rise from sleep has the echo of Jesus raising the little girl and Talitha Kumi, little girl, arise. And perhaps that's our soul, as it were. Herbert is very happy to have that association. Then, of course, because he's a metaphysical poet, he produces an obscure alchemical metaphor, as you do. But it's not that obscure, really. As his death calcined thee to dust, his life may make thee gold and much more just. So the calcining is the absolute burning down purge. It's a purging fire which burns off the dross and leaves you with the essence, which you are then in some way going to transmute. And of course, Herbert had already used that idea of alchemical transmutation in a poem called The Elixir, which we sing as a hymn. I don't know if you sing it as a hymn, where he speaks of Christ. This is the famous stone that turneth all to gold, for that which God doth touch and own cannot for less be told. So he sees Christ as having, by his death, already dealt with the kind of incineration of all things and the purging and the burning. Not simply that by that process of purging in fires he should be gold, but that Herbert and you and I should be made gold by him. His life, that as his death consecrated thee to dust, so may his life may make thee gold and much more just. So that was Rise Heart. Then he he directly quotes Psalm 57, verse 9, the psalm set for Easter morning, in the second verse. Awake my lute and struggle for thy part. That word struggle is why I think this is not a poem of sort of unblemished and easy piety. I don't think that's the way George Herbert works at all. I think his whole life is a struggle, and we need to recognize the struggle and not be ashamed of our own struggles or feel browbeaten, by the apparent effortlessness of others. I mean, he's struggling. I'm sure tuning was a struggle for the lute. I wake my lute and struggle for thy part with all thy art. Then there's this extraordinary lines. The cross taught all word to resound his name, who bore the same. Because the maker, the creator, the word in whom everything was made that was made, without whom nothing was made that was made. That one, when he takes any element, anything comes into contact with him, it's a kind of sanctification, it's a kind of sacramental moment. And the idea that the wood of the cross is so precious that all wood becomes precious. All wood is somehow capable of reminding this. Even the wooden, beautifully crafted sounding board of his lute, with its fretted rose, the lute itself has its own kind of piercings in a pattern in order that it should resound. The cross taught all wood to resound his name. Resound in the sense of resounding, but resound, to speak his name again and again. Indeed, I think you find in this poem an entire theology of resonance, really. And of course, those of you who play instruments and know about instruments know about the idea of sympathetic resonance and the way one instrument can almost hear another, or, the strings on a piano, if they're not dampened, can resonate at a distance with the other strings. I think that's what he's talking about, that there is something resonant now about all wood, but something resonant about the name of Christ because he bore the cross. But of course, when you're playing a lute, the lute is the master metaphor. It doesn't resound unless the strings are taut and tuned. Now, unfortunately, we live under the tyranny of a standardized spelling and orthography, a thing to which I've always objected by misspelling things very badly in school. But the problem is it determines an image. So, when Donne in the poem says that your sun should shine, it doesn't matter whether he writes S-O-N or S-U-N or S-O-N-N-E or S-U-N-N-E, tried all of them in fact, it can mean both the sun that shines and the sun. There's not an orthographic signal as to which of the two meanings the poet wants to be available. And poets who wrote in that period were very conscious that they wanted to make other things. So yes, the modern editor here has said, the cross taught all wood to resound his name. But the word taught is setting you up for what he's going to say about his stretched sinews, because they are taut in the sense that we would say T-A-U-T. But as I say, in those happy days, spelling was not a thing. So the cross taught taught all would to resound his name, who bore the same. Then this great line, his stretched sinews taught again all strings what key is best to celebrate this most high day. You can't read a line with taught and strings in it without hearing both senses of the word. His stretched sinews taught. So think about what he's doing there. The cross itself has become a kind of lute, and Christ himself, stretched, tortuously stretched on the cross, has become the string. I think this is Herbert doing something magnificent in a poetic reimagination of Donne's almost throwaway line that he put in a new string, Messiahs. I can imagine that going into George Herbert's extraordinary imagination and thinking, string, Messiahs, and then when he's riffing on Psalm 57, awake my lute, and he's got the lute, and he's trying to think, he realizes you can't understand Easter without the cross, and you can't understand the cross without Easter. These are aspects of the same salvific event. So to think of Jesus as the string that's being sounded, having to be stretched on the cross. And of course, his stretched sinews, when there's no bronze wound strings, there's no kind of plastic classical strings. This is literally the viscera, the entrails of a living creature that are being stretched on the lute or the viol. So the poetic suggestion of, as it were, that tautness and being taught by that tautness, it's all there. His stretched sinews taught all strings what key. Now key, again, key thing is a tuning. Now later Herbert is going to do something amazing with that, with the idea of which key you're in. If you're in the wrong key, then you need to transpose. And that idea of transposition becomes key to key, see what I did there, to Herbert's poem Prayer. So now we've got the heart rising, having been calcined to dust, now being made gold, with Jesus stretching a hand to help the heart up. Then he's finally up out of bed, so now he's tuning his lute. Awake my lute. That's, two, but he knows there needs to be a third. Consort, the beautiful word from which we get, you have a musical consort, you talk about the idea of consorting together. That is where you're each listening to the other and singing different notes, but in a harmony. Consort both heart and lute, and twist a song pleasant and long. Or, since all music is but three parts vied and multiplied, O let thy blessed spirit bear a part and make up our defects with his sweet art. Now, of course, we've just heard the scholar singing, and we will hear them again at the end of this lecture. But I wonder if you, as the singers, have had that experience. If it's an early morning rehearsal and you're not quite fully there, and you're kind of trying to find your note, it's really good to stand beside a strong singer, isn't it? Even if you're then going to sing, you kind of take your tuning from the people, and it's a real drag. Like if you are the only bass or the only alto, that's terrible. But you hear this other voice and you're able, as it were, to tune up. So he calls on the Spirit, let thy blessed Spirit bear a part. And of course that's very musical things, you bear the part, but obviously it's all to do with bearing. And make up our defects with his sweet art. I think he may well be thinking of that other sermon of Donne's. Yet the Holy Ghost sets this instrument in tune and makes all that is music and harmony in the faculties of this natural man. So it's a kind of triad, the poem. It's kind of three notes of the triad making a chord. And then all of music is that sort of vied and multiplied. So all of that love of music, all that he'd learned from Donne, from genial Uncle John, his mum's mate, it's all there, but it's been wrought beautifully into this three-part poem, which is the whole of which is a response not simply to Psalm 57, but a response to the setting of Psalm 57 on Easter Day. It is, it's the way the New Testament, the great Easter event, reads afresh the Old Testament, which of course is the theme of Richard Hayes's great book, Reading Backwards. So Easter then informs the way we hear Psalm 57, and out of that comes this glorious Easter poem. Now, I've given you another of Herbert's poems because I want to see what more he says about the actual making of music. And this is a poem particularly church music. So those of you who sing in churches, whether in a choir or whether simply in the congregation or whether listening to glorious things on the organ, I think this poem genuinely expresses, gives a voice to something that we may have both individually and collectively experienced. So let's hear the poem, Church Music. It's addressing music itself. It's a kind of apostrophizing music, it's speaking to music. As a kind of beloved, it's almost a love song to music, to church music in particular. Sweetest of sweets, I thank you. When displeasure did through my body wound my mind, you took me thence, and in your house of pleasure a dainty lodging me assigned. Now I in you, without a body, move, rising and falling with your wings. We both together sweetly live and love, yet say sometimes, God help poor kings, comfort, I'll die. For if you post from me, sure I shall do so and much more. But if I travel in your company, you know the way to heaven's door. One of the great last lines of English poetry, and Dylan was not slow in taking it up when he wrote Knocking on Heaven's Door. I do think that's where Dylan was a really deep reader is a really deep reader of English poetry. And just like he took the phrase forever young from Keats, I think he took this from Herbert, but that's beside the point. Let's look again at what this is. First of all, I think it is a love poem. In fact, it's quite a daring love poem. I think you particularly when he says, we both together sweetly live and love, that is a riff on both Raleigh's poem and Marlowe's reply, you know, the shepherds of, come live with me and be my love and we shall all the pleasures prove. We've also had a dainty house of pleasure, I and you. There's a very strongly erotic undertone, if you like, but it's a kind of transfigured eroticism. It's a sublimated eroticism. All that tenderness and delicacy and awareness and concentration and sensitivity to sound and touch that should be in human loving is here given to music. So, sweetest of sweets, there's an endearment. I thank you. When displeasure did through my body wound my mind, you took me thence, and in your house of pleasure a dainty lodging me aside. Now, this is really interesting. We sometimes think that we've only just discovered psychosomatic illness, or that there are bodily causes for, ME, or that there is a physiology of depression. They got their ages before. When displeasure did through my body wound my mind. I just may be depressed for no reason that's to do with, my lack of faith or my other struggles. It's a physiological thing, I don't have enough sunshine, but through my body, something is coming to my mind. Now, scholars can't agree as to what the thence refers to, because he refers to both body and mind. Did through my body wound my mind. You took me thence, and in your... I take this... you took me from my mind, or you took me from my body? I lean towards the thence being here the body, that the body which is doing the wounding. My experience of church music is now almost an out-of-body experience. I may be standing or slumped or, sitting stolidly in my pew, but when the music happens, Suddenly I'm lifted up into the sonic space. And particularly if you're in a beautiful church like this, you've got this sense of you rise with the music and you fall with the music. And all of you will have had that, even if you're just listening to something on earbuds, if you've got your eyes closed. There is a movement and a grace and a fluidity in your experience of the music, a kind of movement which you only wish you could have with your actual body. I mean, in some cases, we're past hoping, but there it is. I can still rise and fall with the wings of music. I've been given wings. My soul, my mind has been given wings. And the healing is now happening. The displeasure which wounded my mind has now been healed in a house of pleasure. And in that house of pleasure, I have a dainty lodging. You've kind of rehomed me in a way that helps me. Now, I and you without a body move. That's why I think it's an out-of-body experience. It's that you took me thence is the body, rising and falling with your wings. We both together sweetly live and love, yet sometimes say, God help poor kings. Obviously in Cambridge, I would naturally take that as a sort of slighting reference to King's College, Cambridge, but I don't think it is. Justified as it might be. But no, I think this is, uneasy lies the head that wears the crown. I can be lifted by this music, and when I do it, the cares of the world are taken from me, and compared with that, the kings of this world are struggling and inferior. I'm being lifted towards Christ the King, and towards that kingship where I will reign in Christ and with Christ with all the saints. So comfort, I'll die. I think comfort, again, he's calling music comfort, call it sweetest of sweets. I'll die, of course, that was used in a sexual way in those days, but it was also used about music, about a dying fall. Obviously, I will die, and I will indeed without a body move, and I will find the way to heaven's door. But I think what he's saying, leave me, I'd just die if you just let me. This has been so important, this musical experience, because it's healing my wounded mind, the mind that was wounded through the body. For if you post from me, sure I shall do so. So if music flees from me, fled away, he doesn't want to find himself in that place that Keats is at the end of the Ode to a Nightingale. Fled is that music. Do I wake or sleep? Rather than having the music fleeing away from him and gradually coming down into echoes, he wants to be taken with the music. Sure, I shall do so and much more, but if I travel in your company, you know the way to heaven's door. So I think he's doing more with music than Donne, his predecessor, has done. He's developing Donne, and yet he comes back to the image in Donne's poem, which he surely knew. He probably will have written this. Donne died in 31, didn't he? And Herbert died in 33, because he died quite young, even though he was 20 years Donne's junior. We don't know the timings of these poems, but he knows that Donne had written about the door, that he'd come. I tune my instrument here at the door. That clearly is heaven's door, because that's what he's going to go into, where heaven is that holy room where with thy choir of saints forevermore I shall be made thy music. So I think there may be a nod back to Donne. If I travel in your company, you know the way to heaven's door. So I now want to turn in the last minutes that are available to me to two lines which hinge quite literally. They're the hinge of the sonnet. If your sonnet is 14 lines, if you go down 7 here from the beginning and 7 from the end, those 2 lines are the musical lines in this great poem. Let me remind you of this poem. This is George Herbert's poem, Prayer, And it's a sonnet, but it's not even a sentence. It doesn't even have a main verb. It's this wonderful cascade of images and emblems, each of which is prayer. It presumes the verb to be without actually writing it. So when he says, prayer, the church's banquet, angel's age, God's breath in man returning to his birth. He's saying each of these is prayer. Prayer is the church's banquet. Prayer is the soul in paraphrase. Prayer is the heart in pilgrimage, and so on. And then prayer is the 6 days world transposing. Do you remember about you know what key? That key transposition thing. He does something which Donne doesn't do beautifully with the metaphor of transposition. But let me just read you the whole poem because it's astonishing. Prayer, prayer, the church's banquet, angel's age, God's breath in man returning to his birth, the soul in paraphrase, heart in pilgrimage, the Christian plummet sounding heaven and earth, engine against the Almighty, sinner's tower, reversed thunder, Christ's side piercing spear. The 6 days world transposing in an hour, a kind of tune which all things hear and fear, softness and peace and joy and love and bliss, exalted manner, gladness of the best, heaven in ordinary, man well dressed, the Milky Way, the bird of paradise, church bells beyond the stars heard, the soul's blood, the land of spices. Something understood. Just total genius. Scholars used to say there are 27 images of prayer in that. I think there are actually 26 distinct images, and then the phrase, something understood, which is not strictly speaking an image. I think there are 26 images because they represent the 26 letters of the alphabet, and I think he's giving you an alphabetic prayer and all the myriad experience of it. And we would be here all evening if I began to say even half of what I love about this poem. I remember saying on various retreats that I led that any one of these images could itself be a whole poem. And then one day I decided I ought to take a leaf out of my own book, as it were, and take my own advice. And I ended up writing a sequence of 27 sonnets in response to this one sonnet, which is in a book called After Prayer. But I want to think just briefly with you about what's going on in those two hinged lines. Some lines get 3 or 4 images to a line. So when he takes 2 lines and they only have 1 image each, you know it's important. So the 6 days world transposing in an hour. Now, there are 2 senses in which you can think of the 6 days world. You can think it, of course, properly to mean the whole creation, the creation that was made in 6 days, the world. And then, of course, the hour is the hour of his service on Sunday, where you're trying to take the whole of that. And that's beautiful, that we're trying to bring everything in, as it were, to our worship, including, the bread which earth has given and human hands have made. And we're praying. Lancelot Andrews, his tutor, was very clear about this in his Preces Privates, private prayers. Every day, he prays for whatever was created on that day, or he allows the image of what was created on that day to determine his prayer every day. And it's wonderful. So he prays for people on the seas, on the days of the seas, and so on. So that's one sense of the 6 days world. But the other sense, I think, since it's contrasted with the hour of prayer on Sunday, is your workaday week. Yeah, just the stuff you have to go through and deal with. Now, if prayer is a transposition of that into an hour, the 6 days world transposing in an hour, what's the analogy that's going on there? I don't know about you, but some of our hymn books, certainly in England, just, for me, because they were originally set for boys' choirs, everything is just too high for me to reach, And I get the music, I can sing it, but it's just not in the right key for me. And if you're in that situation and you have a merciful and talented organist, or even somebody who can just press the button on the keyboard, you can transpose down to a manageable key. Now, when you transpose, you're not changing any of the intervals. You're not changing the tempo. You're not changing the harmony unless you're transposing from major to minor or the other way. but you are making it manageable. You are bringing experience within range. And it seems to me that one of the ways in which he says prayer is the 6 days world transposing in an hour is, frankly, a lot of what happens to us in the week is kind of unmanageable. It's not in our range. It's in the wrong key. The temptation in prayer is to shut the door on the 6 days world. Say, oh, thank God that's over. Now I'm just going to bathe in, beautiful tonality of church music, and I won't bother with all that stuff until the church service is over. Now, I think that would be a misuse of the house of prayer. Herbert says, no, I get that it was unmanageable, but maybe a transposition would help. And then, of course, he moves from that naturally to a kind of tune, which all things hear and fear. And that, I think, goes back to such harmony, to the music of the spheres, which we've kind of not hearing, but we almost half hear, and we're afraid of it because that is the beauty and the harmony that we've kind of fled in a way. We've made ourselves comfortable in the kingdom of noise. And, these searching harmonies, the voice of Christ singing. So I tried in my own ways to respond in poetry to both of those. And in fact, I'm not normally picky to my publisher about how things look, but I tried to make sure that on the pages, my poems on the 6 days world and a kind of tune were facing each other, because I saw them as a continuous thing. I don't know if they're facing each other on your handout. No, but they're on the same page, so that's pretty good. So having expanded that a little bit in prose, I'm just going to close this lecture with these poems. And then I'm happy to say that since I finished with the idea of a song echoing, and we've had so much from Herbert about church music, that when I finished reading the last line, which is about the song of Christ echoing from his empty tomb, I shall just sit down and this scholar will stand up and sing Herbert's beautiful poem, Come My Way, My Truth, My Life. So we will find our way to heaven's door. We will rise and fall on music's wings at the end of this. But let me conclude the lecture. I shall try and give scholarship the kiss of life with a verse. I'll read you these two poems. The 6 days world, transposing in an hour. 24/7 in the 6 days world, in endless cycles of unnerving news, relentlessly our restless hurts are hurled through empty cyberspace. Is there no muse to make of all that pain an elegy, or in those waves of white noise to discern Christ's inner cantus firmus, that deep tone that might give rise at last to harmony? We may not seal it off or drown it out, nor close our hearts down in the hour of prayer, but listening through dissonance and doubt, wait in the space between until we hear a change of key, a secret chord disclosed, a kind of tune, and all the world transposed. A kind of tune. A kind of tune, a music everywhere and nowhere, love's long, lovely undersong, a trace in time, a grace note in the air, born to us from the place where we belong, on every passing breeze, and in the breath of every creature, all things hear and fear. For faintly, through our fall, we too may hear the strong song of the sun that undoes death. And one day, we will hear it unimpaired, the joy of all the sorrowful, the song of all the saints who cry, how long? The hidden hope of all who have despaired. He sang it to his mother in the womb, and now it echoes from his empty tomb. Thank you.
Please do come over to Convocation Hall for refreshments, and Malcolm will take questions and, as I say, autographs and books if you're interested.